talk about Yemen first, where the war has really accelerated and very quietly under the Biden administration. You write, Yemen, January saw highest civilian casualties in Saudi air war since 2016. Dave, what's happening here? Because I thought a year ago Joe Biden said the U.S. was actually ending its offensive support for the Saudi war in Yemen.
Well, yeah. So January, anybody that's been paying attention, we all heard about that Saudi airstrike on a prison in Yemen. It was a migrant detention facility that killed, according to the Yemen Data Project. They compile data on Saudi airstrikes every month, and they email us. You can get on their email list. They send out monthly summaries. And I think this aligns with the numbers from the sources on the ground, the aid groups that were there. It said 91 civilians were killed in that airstrike on the migrant detention facility. And that was preceded by the Saudis bombing some telecommunication infrastructure, which knocked out the internet nationwide in Yemen, making it, the media coverage of the war is already, there's a big media blackout on it, and it's really tough for people in Yemen to get their story out. So right before this big escalation, the Saudis bombed the internet out. And that airstrike also killed a few civilians. I believe 2 children that were playing soccer nearby. I mean, this is really horrific stuff. So yeah, according to their data, and they've been compiling it since 2015, since the war started. January 2022 was the most violent month for civilians since October 2016. And for those that remember it's always been a brutal, horrible war, but the early days of the war, the airstrikes were really bad, really horrific. So, I mean, this is really kind of demonstrates just how major this escalation has been. In total, it's
just real quick, 2 questions. The first is, do you have any idea if the bombing of the telecommunications facility was intentional to knock out the internet? Did Saudi Arabia say why they were targeting that facility? And just because, we've seen in particularly Tigray, Ethiopia, and in Kashmir that the, shutting off, and in Sudan, that shutting off the internet has been a precursor for the ruling governments there to carry out crimes against the civilian population, right? They knock out the internet, that makes it a hell of a lot harder to get any of that information into the hands of journalists, or particularly anyone in the West to, report on what's happening.
It's tough to say if they did it intentionally. I'm not sure. They said that they were just targeting military targets, which is clearly not true. I would have to look back. Jason wrote up something about this strike, and it was known that this tower in Hodeidah was kind of the key to the country's internet. So maybe so there's a chance that they did know. But also, the Saudis they're not the best strategists. So I don't think they're even really smart enough to know that they could take out the internet by bombing that tower. But it's definitely possible.
And then I also just was curious that, maybe the numbers here are a little bit, I don't know, off, just because October of 2016 was when they bombed that funeral in Sana'a and killed 150 something people. And so I was just curious that, maybe it's just these are the particular months that have atrocities that are so they're one mass event. And so all those civilian deaths get counted, where, in between this time, a bunch of civilians were dying, and maybe even in greater numbers. But because, it's 3 civilians here, 2 civilians there, they don't get counted like they do when it's just, again, it seems like that's, really the only time where the numbers really get well documented is when Saudi Arabia blows up a school bus full of 50 children, blows up a funeral, a wedding, or a party or something like that. But those smaller strikes, they kind of just get away with saying, they were Houthi.
Yeah, no, that's true. But if you look through, you could go on their website, the Yemen Data Project, and they have a spreadsheet of all the airstrikes they've recorded, and it's not all of them. And these are, I believe, lower end estimates. They don't know for sure. They're pretty conservative with their numbers. So you had 91 in that one strike, and for the total of the whole month, it was 139 civilians were killed, and about 287 were wounded. Um, so there was also strikes that they, and they people should get on this email list because they have good graphs and charts that show all the civilian infrastructure that they recorded being bombed. Some hospitals were bombed. They said a food storage unit, a food truck, residential areas, and did I say hospitals? They said 2 hospitals were struck. So this is a pattern that we've seen throughout the whole war. These little strikes are always happening, even if they're not killing civilians. They're still targeting civilian infrastructure. It's happened the whole time, and more people notice, obviously, with these mass casualty events. They said that this latest strike, was the third most violent, the third highest civilian casualty rate of any single air raid in the war. So, and this came after the Houthis launched a few missiles and drones at the UAE. One strike killed 3 people. I believe they were migrant workers at the oil facilities that they hit. So that's kind of the justification for this escalation. But, missing always the context from the Western media reports, from what the Saudis and the Emiratis say. This war has been going on since 2015, and the Houthis, they wouldn't be doing these attacks if not for that. It's simple. It sounds silly to have to say, but I think it's really worth repeating a lot. Because, you could say, the Houthis killed civilians, but it's clearly a response. And the UAE, they downplay their role in the war, in the coalition. They're not as involved in the bombings as they used to be, from what I understand, or they say so. They could just be lying. But they have always supported militants on the ground, and they've been backing this group called the Giants Brigade that's been having success against the Houthis. And, the UAE, there's very extensive reporting, probably repeating myself, stuff I said the last time I was on your show, but that they funded Al-Qaeda fighters to be part of these militias against the Houthis. This is documented. These are facts. So in response to all this, the Biden administration has escalated its role in the war, and they sent the USS Cole. Out of all the ships they could have sent to this area, was the USS Cole, which was attacked off the coast of Yemen before 9/11. One of the first major Al-Qaeda attacks against the U.S. So, and F-22s, they said General McKenzie, the head of CENTCOM, was just in the UAE, and he's saying, we got to work with you guys, work on technology so you can pretty much so that they could hit the Houthi drones and missiles before they're launched, so they could bomb Yemen more, is pretty much what they're saying. The U.S. is really, as the Saudis are escalating the air war, the U.S. is escalating its role. It's been over a year since Biden said he would end support for the war, and it's clearly hasn't happened. And his State Department, they just approved a few arms sales for the Saudis and the UAE that will upgrade their missile defense systems. So the arms sale continue, support for Saudi Air Force continues, and now we got some new warships and warplanes there. And, the U.S. has been intercepting missiles since the Houthis started the attacks in the UAE. So they're directly involved militarily in the war.
Yeah. When we were talking about on the show, even before it happened, Dave, that the UAE was backing the Giants Brigade. And I was saying, like, hey, whenever you back a Salafist militia and launch an attack against a group, well, then there might be some repercussions from that. And I was kind of surprised that it got as far as it did, where they were actually able to, like, hit sites in the UAE with these drones. But that is somewhat significant, right? That they are able to hit the UAE, because Saudi Arabia and most of the targets, I believe, are on the Saudi, like, West Red Sea coast, which are closer to the northern Yemen areas, that the Houthis hold. So I don't know. Do you see any? I know in the past the U.S. has had some direct attacks against the Houthi. I think it was only after the U.S. or the Houthi apparently target U.S. ships that were enforcing the blockade of Yemen in the Red Sea, and they hit a few sites after that. But do you think the U.S. is actually looking at any direct action against the Houthi, or are they just talking about potentially giving them support within the country? I think, Biden just had the big announcement, of course, billions in weapons, jets to the to the Jordanians, but also upgrading the Emirati and the Saudi air defense systems.
Yeah, I think it's possible that the U.S. might start attacking the Houthis directly. They haven't been saying that. They're not really coming under much criticism for the war in Yemen right now. There's been some good writing on it and stuff, but I don't really see much pressure in Congress. It seems like they've bought the defensive narrative, as you saw that from they couldn't block a recent missile sale in the Senate to the Saudis, and you had people like Chris Murphy that were opposed to these arms sales change their mind and buy this narrative that it's defensive in nature. They don't want to upset the Democratic administration too much. So yeah, it's kind of things can really escalate from here because the Houthis aren't going to back down. And it really shows their success at hitting targets inside the UAE, inside Saudi Arabia. It shows that the blockade on Yemen has done nothing to slow their weapons advances, and it's just starving people. And then that gets into I think the next article you wanted to talk about was the fact that the White House recently had a meeting on redesignating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. So that was a move made by the Trump administration in the final weeks, and it basically blacklists all the Houthis. It makes you, if you do business with the Houthis, if they're labeled a terrorist organization, that opens you up for U.S. sanctions. Houthi, I doubt any Houthi leaders have assets in the U.S., so sanctions against them, terror designation against them, it does nothing to hurt them. But what it will do is discourage businesses and banks from processing transactions with the Houthis, and it could essentially criminalize the delivery of food to Yemen's starving civilian population, and most of them live in the areas of North Yemen that the Houthis control. So it won't do anything to the Houthis really, and all it could do is push more Yemenis into starvation. So it's really just cruel and unnecessary, and they would be doing it at the behest of the UAE, because the UAE requested it after these recent Houthi attacks. So yeah, it's really about if that happens, I mean, things are just going to get about as bad as they could be in Yemen.
Yeah. And I remember, I think the last time this happened last year, the one of the points made by the aid groups was Yemen, I think, is the most reliant country in the world on remittance, people sending money back to their family in Yemen. Like, that's how a lot of people get income. And designating the Houthis a foreign terror group will basically make it so no companies will transact those small things, right? Because you can't run the risk of some guy sending money to Yemen and it going to AQAP, right? And so you're just going to cut it off completely. Any money going to northern Yemen can't happen, can't go to the Houthis and everything. So they cut off these kind of transactions when the U.S. Announces these kind of sanctions. So I think that it was one of the warnings last time. I'm guessing it's still a major issue. Dave, anything else on Yemen? I mean, you mentioned that you really don't see any action in Congress. I saw that I think Rep. Jim McGovern had proposed something where we would end offensive support to Saudi Arabia but maintain defensive support, and so just kind of enshrining this Biden policy into law. But they did announce a new arms sale to Saudi Arabia, and while it is missile defense upgrades, maybe Rand Paul, maybe somebody will make a big deal about this and try to block these things. But do you have any hope for that?
For the missile defense, those sales, I don't really think anybody's going to take action against it. Just because it didn't really make any headlines. Nobody seemed to really notice. So, I mean, that's the thing. More people just have to be aware of what's happening and have to share these numbers and just see how there's this huge escalation. And it's not defensive in any sense of the word, anything that's happening here. And it's accomplishing nothing. So more people just got to spread the word and, get the word out. And kind of do a better job, because there is a lot of grassroots organizations in DC for all the things that happen in that city. That one of the best campaigns in recent years was the push to end the war in Yemen. So hopefully, we should get more involved and encourage that kind of stuff.